Fairy tales are both stories of transformation and symbolic poetry. They are gifts from our ancestors, offering symbols and guidance for our human development. In this show, artist, philosopher, and teacher Sean Kramer will lead us into the imaginal realm of fairy tales, where we will find healing images and wise teachings for our own journey through this enchanted world. So welcome to Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales.
Welcome back, everyone, to Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales. And in this time of meditation, visualization, we will journey through the fairy tale called The Frog Prince. And as I subtitled this meditation, Time and Development in Fairy Tales. As we have in previous sessions looked a lot at the landscape, we will do that also in this one, the imaginary landscape of the fairy tale. But we will also think more about the aspect of time, and particularly not so much the idea of clock time, but developmental, transformational time. So to begin, I would like us to do a little visualization to enter into the imaginal dream world of the fairy tales. So first, let us bring our attention, our awareness into our bodies. So as you breathe in, breathe your awareness inward and down and throughout your body. Let your awareness fill your whole body, your arms, chest, legs, as if it was a container for your awareness, attention, and consciousness. Take a few breaths, breathing your awareness in and breathing out tension, relaxing. Remember, relaxation is the bridge to these deeper worlds. And now I would like you to visualize before you a golden thread. You've come upon and discovered a beautiful, brilliant, attractive thread of gold. You pick it up and you start to gather it and wind it up into a ball. Imagine winding this thread around and around to make a golden ball. And now absorb that golden ball into yourself, into your heart. Now take a deep breath in, and then a deep, relaxing breath out. Now, as I mentioned, in the previous meditations on fairy tales, a theme we looked at was the landscape as symbolic and as also structuring the stories. We saw a common pattern in the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel and the fairy tale Fitcher's Bird. that they both had this same structure of outside the forest, then a forest inside the forest, and they both had a kind of mysterious, fantastic house inside the forest. And then the story, the characters left the forest and returned outside the forest. And that is a common fairy tale structure. Sometimes it's, instead of going to the forest, the fairy tale might lead us underground to the underworld and then back up again. And some things we saw about this landscape and the meaning of the forest, which we're going to meet again in this fairy tale today, The Frog Prince, that going into the forest was going into a kind of inner world. So in Hansel and Gretel, their journey into forest was almost like them going into their dream world, where in their life at home, they were desiring love and nourishment from their mother, but instead received rejection, abandonment, even threat of death. So they go into the forest and they find this image of their desire, of their mother, a house that is nourishing, protective. But then they go inside and find a woman who wants to harm them. So in a more fantastic, imaginal way, they find in the forest their own outer conflicts that they're experiencing in the inner world. And they work through these conflicts in the forest and come out transformed, having resolved their conflicts in very deep level, almost an unconscious level. In Fitcher's Bird, the girl goes into the forest and finds a house made by a wizard that is wonderful, luxurious. She gets everything she wants, but there's a room where something awful is hidden. And that represents her own inner world, that in her imagination she has created a protection, a fantasy dwelling to keep herself from looking at something that she is afraid of or finds traumatizing. Now, in this fairy tale, The Frog Prince, we have something similar to that, but also something different. And we will include that landscape dimension, but bring in the time dimension. And the actual structure of our story has 3 scenes. The first one is actually in a forest. In this fairy tale, we begin right in the forest, which I think is significant. It's not a journey into the forest. It starts in the forest and then tells us more about after leaving the forest. The first scene is a forest. The second one is at a table having a meal. And then the fairy tale ends in a bedroom. So we go from a forest to a dinner table to a bedroom. And we will first walk through our fairy tale part by part, and then we'll come back and look more at the fairy tale as a whole and see what that reveals to us when we see the whole thing together. So the fairy tale begins right in a forest, in a dark forest. And there is a little more implicit, this similar landscape structure, even though the actual movement of the story doesn't follow the landscape since it starts in the forest. But we are to understand that there's an outside the forest, a house, a home, maybe a castle where the girl lives. Then there's the dark forest. And in the middle of this dark forest, there's a well. So we have that pattern that we've seen in Hansel and Gretel and Fitzgerald's a Bird. Outside the forest, a dark forest, and something in the middle of the forest. And in this case, a deep well. But the story structure doesn't follow so simply that pattern, but we have to keep that in mind. So it's almost like we are picturing a kind of mandala where there's the outer world, the home life, the family, our ordinary world, and there's a dark forest, and in the center of the forest is a well. And we're told that the well is so deep that one cannot see the bottom. So we are beginning right away in this fairy tale at a mysterious center of ungraspable depths. So that picture, that kind of circular mandala picture with this center of water that goes down so deep that it is unfathomable. And in this forest is, and it tells us, like fairy tales often do, that the girl is a princess. And this fairy tale, The Frog Prince, is actually the first fairy tale in all the editions of the Grimms. It's number 1. And in kind of altered versions, and we'll look at some of those differences, but it's still a very classic fairy tale. And the fairy tale, and this one addressed mostly to little girls. I know that it's often taught to almost like kindergarten children, told to them. And some people have objected to the idea of the princess in fairy tales, more from kind of our American animation versions than I think from the actual older fairy tales. But why do the fairy tales have the children, the little girl, identify herself as a princess and the boy as a prince? Well, it's not so much an economic or reality to something great. Something so great and mysterious that it can be symbolized by a radiant golden solar crown. But to be a princess or a prince is not just a symbol of potentiality to something great, but a symbol of destiny. It not so much tells a child, but expresses an inner feeling that we have as children, that we have a destiny, that we are meant to develop and realize some great potentiality, symbolized by a king or queen, and that it would actually be an awful tragedy and violation of our deep nature to fail or reject this destiny, this potentiality. And the little girl is playing with a golden ball. So just right away, let's picture this imagery and think about what the fairy tale is doing. This is just first couple sentences, if we read it in the Grimm's version. And it's very non-descriptive, just tells us that there's a dark forest with a bottomless well and a little girl playing with a golden ball. The fairy tale tend to be very brief, non-descriptive, not flowery language. Sometimes when they're turned into literary versions, that's changed. But they're almost kind of a Zen-like austerity in the imagination. The kind of mastery and depth and poetry of the fairy tale is not in adjectives or developed similes or florid language, but in this very powerful, simple placement of ordinary objects in very evocative combination. Forest, well, a little girl playing with a golden ball. I like to recommend to people interested in fairy tales to learn the fairy tale almost by memory, not word by word, but that you have the pictures. You can go over the fairy tale in your mind and then just sit in your imagination with these images and let their power unfold for you. The golden ball will come back again when we see the whole fairy tale and look at it in context. But it has, I think, an obvious imagery likeness to a sun, right? A golden sphere. And she's playing with this golden ball, and she loses control of it, and it goes down, drops down into the well, into the darkness, the bottomless well. So there we already see, I think it's a secondary symbolism maybe, but it's of time, right? Of the sun, the light, the day and the night, the warm part of the year, the dark winter of the year, the natural cosmic time. So this little girl is encountering or having break into her life some of the mysteries of the vaster cosmic evolving universe. Now, she's looking into the well, very upset that she's crying, that she's lost her golden ball. She cries and says to herself that she would give anything if only she could get the golden ball back. She would give her clothes, her gemstones, her pearls, anything in the world, she says, to get back the golden ball that I have lost. So in this state of deep loss of what constituted her happiness, her focus, her desire, the center of her world, she's in this state of loss, looking down into the well that is so deep she cannot see its bottom, she can't see the ball where it's went. And out of the water arises a frog. The frog arises from these unknown depths, these watery depths, these deep, unconscious sources. Something comes up, something mysterious, kind of dreamlike, unusual, symbolic. A frog, a talking frog. So in this story, the dreamlike inner world of the forest um, is presented as a source, a deep well from which things arise. Symbols which, as we'll see, initiate mysterious transformations in the girl's outer life. So in this way, it's different than Hansel and Gretel, where they start outside with their problems and go into the symbolic, unconscious world. Here, we begin with that. The girl is there, and something is arising out of it. In both cases, it's connected with what happens outside the forest. But in this story, we don't know yet what's going to happen. But it's almost like what happens here is the dreamlike symbolization of what is going to happen to her outside the forest, in the more ordinary world of her home and family. So the frog arises from the well and learns that, or maybe knows already, but she tells him that her golden ball has fallen in the well and says, well, almost dismissively, "How can you help me, you ugly frog?" We already have something that's going to be through the story, her repulsion for this thing that has come out of the well. And let's listen to what the frog says to her. He says to her, "I do not want your pearls, your gemstones, your clothes," which she had said she would give for the golden ball. That's how she thought she would get it back. "I do not want your pearls, your precious stones, your clothes, but if you will accept me as a companion, a friend, partner, and let me sit next to you and eat from your plate, and sleep in your bed, and if you'll love and cherish me, then I will bring your golden ball back to you." So there he lays down the steps and conditions which would allow her to get back this golden ball that she has lost and that has put her in this state of devastation and desperation, so much that she feels she would give anything in her life, in her world, to get it back. So he says that she must accept her and let him sit next to her and eat from her plate. So they must eat together and sleep in her bed. And we'll see that the story follows those steps. There's the table, eating will be the next scene, and then the bedroom. And that will allow her to get the golden ball back. So the frog is saying something to pay attention to, that the golden ball really won't be given back to her till all these things happen, and that's not going to be till the end of our story. So the princess thinks to herself, what is this stupid frog trying to say? So she doesn't understand what the frog is saying, what this is really about. So this frog has arisen from the well and expressed something, that maybe some desires, not for what the girl has offered, right, or thinks will get back the golden ball. Desires that come from deep down but are now beginning to arise for her, but are still strange to her. She hasn't owned or understood these things that are arising, that the frog expresses. So she agrees, but not really seriously, not grasping what is happening. She says, okay, maybe he can get my ball and I'll just agree with him. So she says, yes, just bring me back my golden ball and I'll promise to do all that. Now the frog hasn't, and this is in the earlier editions of the fairy tale, he hasn't asked her to promise. He said that you just must do these things to get your ball. But she says, okay, I'll do it, but she doesn't really think that she will or that it's even possible. She doesn't understand what it even would mean to do what he says. So it says the frog dives down and returns with the golden ball in his mouth, throws it onto the land. The little girl picks it up and rushes away, totally forgetting the whole thing or repressing or denying it. The frog calls out to her, but she pays no attention to him and runs away. But we can see that, so symbolically, it's showing that the golden ball will be given back by the frog. But according to the frog's words, she really hasn't gotten it back. She's almost like had a dream that this lost golden ball would be given back by a frog. So now we move to the next scene of the story, which is the girl is sitting at her table where she eats. It says the next day the princess was sitting at her table when she heard something on the steps outside her house. A sound, a squishy sound, plop, plop. Right? So this thing is coming after her from the depths, still bringing with it these bottomless, mysterious waters up to her door. She hears the sound, goes to the door, and sees that it's the frog whom she had completely put out of her mind. She had repressed this. It was like a forgotten dream. And in fear and repulsion, she slams the door and returns to her table. So for this little girl who has an arranged life, a table set, a place where she can control and arrange her environment, decide who sits with her, something has arisen from watery depths that she is very uncomfortable with. And she wanted to ignore and forget, and now it's knocking on her door. So again, she tries to block it out. She slams the door against this thing that's arising that she doesn't want in her life. And for us, this happens really over and over again, that changes start occurring in our established orderly world, which we cannot stop. They come from dark forests, deep wells, from sources that we cannot grasp and see the depths of. And with a power and insistence and mysteriousness that we might like to block out, but they follow us and keep arising and knocking. So into this orderly environment of this little child, this ugly, sliming thing arises from these bottomless waters that are in the dark forest of her mind, her soul. And she thought she could leave it there. Even though it arose, she thought she could forget it, leave it there, but now it's come to her door knocking and wanting to be not only allowed to enter, but accepted and loved, embraced, integrated. Even though it's still wet, slimy, carrying that cold, wet darkness of the well. It's like a dream or memory of a time when we felt some great loss of our golden ball, our comfort, our desires, and saw it fall into a black depths, kind of bottomless, abysmal, that we intimated was the sources of deep things in ourselves, our very desires, fears, and we run away from that experience and vision. We want to quickly forget that scary, incomprehensible thing we've experienced and intimated that is our own source, and the actual source of our so-called ordinary life, and the changes that are happening. But we like to block it out because it's deep, dark, it can be scary, repulsive, slimy. There's a phrase from a poet: what is the origin of all these forms that I see? The source of all that will be born. This girl somehow touched upon that, but wants to shut it out. And it's her father that forces the integration or forces the contact with this frog. He asks her what has happened and says, you've had this encounter, you made some kind of promise, and there's no going back. This is what's happening. This is your kind of destiny. And it's interesting that there's a lot of stories that have some similarities, and we'll later look at some of the others, where a girl's future partner or husband is some kind of animal. And the connection or perseverance of the girl with this, what seems to her an animal, is made through the father. So the frog comes in and sits at the table and eats with her, and now we go to the next step in the tale that goes into the bedroom. The fairy tale says, when the frog had eaten all he wanted, he said, now I am tired and want to sleep. Take me to your room, make your bed, so that we can lie in it together. And the princess was horrified when she heard that. She was afraid of the cold frog and did not dare to even touch him, yet he was supposed to lie next to her in her bed. She began to cry and didn't want to at all. So her resistance and actual fear, horror, is becoming intensified. But the king becomes angry and commands her to do what she had promised. So it says she has to do what her father wanted, but in her heart she was bitter, angry, disturbed, troubled. So she picks up the frog with 2 fingers, touching him as little as she can, and she carries him into her bedroom, climbs into her bed, but instead of laying the frog next to her, like she's been told to do and promised to do, she throws the frog against the wall. Splat. She throws this frog and splatters him against the wall and shouts out, "Now leave me in peace, you disgusting frog." Now what happens next is from that splatter, the frog comes down off the wall onto the bed as a handsome young prince. And the fairy tale ends. When the frog came down onto the bed, he was a handsome young prince, and he was her dear companion. And she held him in esteem as she had promised, and they fell asleep together with pleasure. Now, when this fairy tale was translated from the German into English, the translator, Edgar Taylor, changed that. And instead of her throwing the frog splat against the wall, and that being the means of transformation, he had the frog sleep in her bed for 3 nights, and then he becomes a prince. And then we have other versions where the princess must kiss the frog. So interesting, they changed that, which I think is actually something very profound and interesting, that the transformation comes from her really expression of disgust and an act of violence. So to see, maybe get more idea of what that might mean, let's go back and look at the story as a whole. So that's the whole story. We've seen it. Begins with a golden ball, goes through this conflict with this ugly frog, and ends with the girl and the prince falling asleep together in bed with pleasure. Now, let me ask you a question. How old do you think the girl is in this story? And how much time has passed through the story? Often people have a little trouble saying exactly how old she is. There's kind of a conflict. She seems like a child with a golden ball, then she's married in bed sleeping with a man at the end. And it actually doesn't even say she was married. In later versions they added that he becomes her husband. But I think it's just put very briefly. Sometimes people will say, well, in maybe some older times or different cultures, the girl were married off very young. But if we think of it, look at it. So the conflict is that it's in the beginning. It seems you would imagine she's really a young little child playing with a ball, toy. At the end, she's a young adult with a partner, a man or husband. And the literal time of the story is really 2 days and 2 nights, because it tells us that the frog comes at the door when the girl is sitting at the table the next day. And then she takes him into her room, and then they spend the night together. So we've had 2 days and 2 nights as the story has literally told us. But we see that what the story is telling us about. Well, let's think about some of the symbolism, and we'll unfold it, and especially the golden ball and the frog. The golden ball, in the beginning, her whole delight, pleasure is in this golden ball. It's a very childlike image. She's a child at the beginning playing with the golden ball, which then she loses, and it goes down into a well that she can't see where it goes. So that is an image of what we experience as children, that there's a period where we live in these childlike games and delights, and then we move into a phase where they don't give us that same joy and fascination anymore. We start to lose those childhood delights. They fall away from us and sink back to we know not where, and we feel that as a great loss. We want to go back to that and regain those delights of childhood. So we feel this terrible loss. I remember my little sister had an imaginary friend, as a lot of children do, who was Snoopy in her imagination, and she would talk to him on this toy phone. And he was very real to her, and me and her other older brothers found that amusing, and we would say, oh, do you want to talk to Snoopy? We'd bring out our phone and like to watch her talk to Snoopy. And we would do that, and she would respond and have conversations. And then suddenly she didn't want to do that anymore. We would say, oh, here's the phone. Do you want to call Snoopy? And she said no. And we said, why not? And she said, Snoopy's gone away. We said, where did he go? And she said, he went to Spain. I don't know where that came from, but she was changing. She wasn't able to find that same delight or satisfaction or kind of imagination or whatever it was giving her to talk with this imaginary friend. So she expressed it by saying he went away. Of course, he didn't go away. He wasn't there. But it was a change in her that she was expressing symbolically by saying this childhood friend went away. That's like the loss of the golden ball. We had it, and it's this child, we had that fantasy. Maybe we had imaginary friends. We had these games we could enter into, and then it goes away. We lose it, and we might feel a real sadness in it. I know I did, and found it difficult and confusing, and wondered what happened, or did I do something wrong? How could I get that back, that golden ball? Now, what about the frog that comes out of the well, and why is the future prince in the form of a frog? In other fairy tales, it's the future partner or husband of the girl or young woman is also often an animal, but different animals. She's just said a beast in Beauty and the Beast. He is, or a lion or a bear. In this fairy tale, it's a frog. So it's a little different energy to it. A lion or a bear or a beast is kind of an object of fear, aggression, something that could potentially be violent to us, hurt us. So that could be symbolizing the young woman's fear of that potentially powerful violence that could come from the man, her partner or husband. But the frog doesn't evoke that, but it evokes kind of disgust and revulsion. She's repelled by it, not really frightened as an object of violence, but of something disgusting. And so that's a very good image for the discomfort, anxiety of a young girl in relation to her future sexual partner, regarding the things about the sexual intimacy that seem repulsive or disgusting, unpleasant to her. This ugly, slimy frog that she doesn't even want to touch. So something that is meant to be and will become a source of pleasure for the girl at first is something that is not seen as pleasurable or desirable, but something repulsive and disgusting. So the story gives a beautiful image. One folklore scholar said it's the most meaningful expression of this transition of a girl from a child to womanhood, and some of the feelings and desires and anxieties that she experiences. So the three parts of the story are actually three phases in a human development, of a part of human development, not the whole human life, but there's the first part of the story, there's the delight in the golden ball, which is the childhood. Then begins a new phase when the golden ball is lost and something else begins to arise, which will eventually become a replacement for the golden ball, will give her the delight that she had in the golden ball, but in that middle period, it's actually a source of inner conflict. And at the end of the story, that conflict is resolved. She's in the stage of adult life, of intimacy, and the physical and emotional intimacy of adult life are a source of pleasure for her. So at the end of the story, she's actually got back the golden ball. It says she falls asleep in her bed with the prince with pleasure. The state that she had at the beginning, the pleasure, and lost in the middle, is regained, not with a toy, but with another human being, in this case, a sexual partner. So the story, though it is told as if it takes place over a couple days, is really describing what happens over years. The transition from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood, and especially in regard to sexual intimacy. This story is, as I said, often told to very young children, like 5-year-old children, and they love it. But certainly consciously, they don't understand what it's about. But at some level, obviously, they do, because they want to hear it and they delight in it. And what's happening is the fairy tale is giving the child images of what she will go through, but cannot understand because she hasn't experienced it yet. But so the child is going to go through these changes and is starting to feel these things and has maybe some intimations, but can't understand it, but is helped by getting images for it. We actually hunger for these images, symbolic images of our development towards stages which we haven't reached yet. So the story, and we'll see this more as a theme as we go along, that fairy tales, as I've seen them, are very much doing what this story does, symbolizing the processes of human development. And in this case, the emphasis is on the change in desires, that as we go through changes in life and development, our growth involves changing our desires. So not attaining our desires always, but actually losing those desires and letting new desires arise. So it's different than a story about having a goal and desire and overcoming things and getting what you want. This is actually a story about changing what you want and telling you that the things you want now and find so important and delightful and pleasurable are going to change and are meant to change. You're meant to let go of the desires and discover things, new desires for things that haven't yet arisen in your consciousness. A friend of mine said when he was a little boy that he sometimes thought his father was really not very smart because he observed that his father made a lot of money, and he saw he had enough money to fill the whole refrigerator with soda pop. I mean, they could just have soda pop all day long and all different kinds, and his father didn't do that. And he just thought his father just might not be all that smart with his money, because if he had that money, and when he gets that money and grows up and has a job, he is going to definitely fill the refrigerator with soda pop. And my friend is grown up now, and he does not have a refrigerator full of soda pop. His desires changed. Things that he couldn't imagine would give him happiness then give him happiness now, and the things that seem so important and desirable at the earlier phase fade away and don't give that same delight and pleasure. And if we don't let this process happen, we become stuck and fixated and stagnated, like someone who just stays in Willy Wonka land with chocolate rivers and candy growing on trees, or who stays with beach parties and teen music, and we just, those things give us pleasure at a certain phase, but there are things that we can't even imagine, and this continues to happen through life, and especially if we allow it and don't resist it. So if we can take a few final minutes, I don't know if Suleiman, if there are any comments or questions on this fairy tale or any points about it.
I might have missed it while I was tuning in, but did she eventually kiss the frog, and did it turn into a human?
Okay, yeah. That's good. Let me finish with, or point out that no, in this story, and I'm taking it from the very first edition of the Grimms. What she does is she throws the frog against the wall in disgust, and it falls down, bounces off the wall into her bed as a prince. So the idea of kissing the frog is a later thing, and it actually later versions, as I said, they translate in English. They didn't quite get that. That seems strange, so they put different ways that the frog changes, like kissing it. But in this one, it's an act of violence. She expresses what she's been holding back, right? She's been disgusted more and more, but her father's been telling her she has to do this, and she finally just breaks down and totally lets out her feelings and throws the frog against the wall, and it turns into the prince. And to me, that's very interesting and intriguing and insightful. And the way I see it is, for one thing, so in doing that, she breaks her promise, and she disobeys the father, and she just expresses what she really is feeling. And then she breaks through that inner conflict and is finally able to have a relationship with the prince. And I see the prince turning into the frog, is really her own perception. Right? In other words, this person and this experience and relationship seem disgusting and then becomes pleasurable. And the change that occurs is through her finally really expressing her feelings and also breaking with her father. So that seems to make a lot of sense if you think about it. It doesn't seem so strange. In other words, the girl is leaving her father, which was her first male attachment, is going to be attached to another man, but she's in a conflict, and she needs to make some kind of break with the father, and also be able to express her inner world, her emotional intimacy, in order to have this physical sexual intimacy in a satisfactory way. There has to be this ability for the emotional expression of difficult feelings. So that's how I see that symbolic transformation, and it seems to me much more rich that it's an act of anger, expression of anger, that both makes a certain break with her father and allows her to be truthful about her conflicted feelings about this relationship, and that makes the breakthrough.
Yeah, it is super interesting. I don't think a lot of people would realize that, originally it wasn't the princess kissing the frog.
Right. And to me, that it's much more like kind of provocative and psychologically deep, the original one, that I could see that people would change it to fit their ideas, but it seemed like there's more insight and depth in the earlier one.
Definitely. It's I like this story a lot.
Yes, yeah, it's very, yeah, I think there's so much there to it.
Well, thank you.
And yes, so in the next one, our next session, I'll actually just focus on the idea of archetypes, and we'll use these fairy tales we looked at before, and we'll talk about continuing in this theme of developmental transitions. This one we focused on the change of desires, but there's also the idea of a change of archetypes, which we can see the frog as too. But so that's what I think next time we can just focus on that theme, because it's sometimes said that fairy tales are archetypal, but not really explained what that really means, what archetypes are, and how we see them in the fairy tale. So we won't take a new fairy tale next time, but we'll use the ones we've seen and go deeply into the idea of archetypes.
Brilliant. And I think that is, that's November 18th.
Okay, yes.
November 18th, and that will start at 12:30 p.m.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Did you want to do a meditation to end it, or?
Yes, I would. Sure, we can finish with a brief meditation.
Okay, cool. Go ahead.
Okay. So let us come back again into our own bodies, our feelings. And with our awareness in our body, let us have great respect to this mysterious being that we are, and the unfathomable depths of time from which we have come. Our feelings, the sexuality was evolved 1 billion years ago. We carry that. It took a whole of 14 billion years to make the chemistry of our body. So we and our being and our feelings and our life process come from this bottomless well. In great awe, we appreciate that and trust this mysterious process of which we are a part. So thank you for being with me.